Okay, so this video is going to have a look at starting right at the beginning. The arms race itself begins with the atomic bomb. This started all the way back in 1939 with the USA, although not officially in the war. It began to look into the creation of an atomic weapon. It was supported by the United Kingdom and Canada, and it began working on what was known as the Manhattan Project. In essence, an attempt to create an atomic weapon before Nazi Germany, because of the fear that the Nazis would use it indiscriminately on a range of different targets. By July 1945, so after 6 years of research, scientists actually created a weapon. They succeeded in breaking down the atom, creating fission, and creating a weapon that they co-named Gadget. And this was tested in the New Mexico desert and the mainland of the United States of America in what was known as the Trinity test, with a image of that test just down there. So they succeeded in creating this weapon of enormous power, and they tested it. However, the USA is going to go further. They're going to subsequently use this weapon. They're going to use the atomic bomb to end the Second World War. They're going to use it on Japan. Okay, you can remember by July 1945, Germany has surrendered. They're no longer an issue. They surrender in May, so it's only the Japanese still in the war. So the USA are going to use that weapon to bomb Japan. And it's the only time an atomic weapon's ever been used, or a nuclear weapon, in fact, has been used on a civilian population. So on August the 6th, 1945, they dropped the bomb on Hiroshima. And the resulting fireball and the blast killed 80,000 civilians and injured another 70,000, as well as destroying the majority of Hiroshima. Japanese government sources record something like 69% of Hiroshima's buildings were completely destroyed. And of those civilians who were killed, a great deal, ceased to exist. Those at the center of the explosion were completely incinerated to the point where all that was left of them was a black outline on the floor where they'd been burnt into it. So the USA had demonstrated extreme power by dropping this bomb on Hiroshima. Again, the only time in human history it's ever happened. However, the Japanese government refused to surrender. They refused to give up. And on August the 9th, a second atomic bomb is dropped, this time on Nagasaki, killing 40,000, injuring another 60,000. This finally convinced the Japanese government to surrender, and it ends the Second World War. But why did the USA choose to do this? Why did they go down the route of using such a devastating weapon rather than the conventional means that they had used against Germany? Well, there's a number of reasons. One, they feared that an invasion of Japan would lead to mass US casualties. And some of the generals predicting 500,000 US fatalities. And one of the reasons for this is that they believed the Japanese would fight to the end. There were reports that the Japanese government was instructing school children on how they could fight back against US soldiers. When the US had invaded Iwo Jima, had invaded Okinawa, as they got closer to the Japanese mainland, the resistance had increased massively. And actually, at Okinawa, somewhere in the region of a third of Japanese civilians on that island were killed by US forces. And the Japanese soldiers there, and again on Iwo Jima as well, fought almost to the last man. So it looked very much like an invasion of mainland Japan itself would bring about that kind of fighting. Truman also wants to end the war really quickly. Okay, he doesn't want the Soviet Union to invade and take over Japanese territory. And one reason for this is the fear that the USSR is just going to take that territory. It's just going to keep that territory, as it's going to do in the East. Remember, Truman was very clear at Potsdam that there had to be free and fair elections because he doesn't trust the Soviets. And you see this in Korea. You see that the Soviets and the Americans meet on the 49th parallel, and that where the Soviets are in what is now North Korea, they're going to establish a communist nation. Truman also wants to use the atomic bomb to intimidate the Soviet Union. He wants to show the Soviets that America has access to this weapon that can destroy an entire city with one bomb. And so therefore that America is the true superpower. And one reason for this is that the Soviets have got more manpower. They've got more physical soldiers and tanks than the USA. But if Truman's got an atomic bomb, he can counteract that. It gives America a fighting chance of intimidating the Soviets. And finally, the US government wanted to test the atomic bomb. Okay, it wanted to see how powerful it was. And one of the reasons for picking Hiroshima is it's what's referred to as a virgin target. It hadn't been bombed during the Second World War. So all of the damage done to Hiroshima on August 6th was purely from the atomic bomb, which allowed Truman to show the world what America was capable of. And these two reasons here, these two middle reasons, these lead to increased tension during the Cold War because the Soviets now feel threatened, they feel worried, they feel scared that the Americans have this weapon that they don't have. And remember, during the Berlin crisis, Truman will move US bombers capable of carrying the atomic bomb to Britain simply to intimidate the Soviets. Okay, and the fact that Truman's trying to end the war so quickly shows that he doesn't trust the Soviets, which again leads Stalin to believe the Americans are conspiring against him. Truman, of course, doesn't trust Stalin at all and believes that Stalin is going to use the invasion of Japanese-occupied territory to spread communism throughout Indochina, so throughout Korea, throughout Vietnam, into Thailand, potentially then into Malaya and eventually into India. And he wants to stop that. So the end result of the dropping of the atomic bomb is a huge increase in tension as America feels that they have hold the power and the Soviets. So how do the Soviets respond? Well, from 1942, they'd actually had their own atomic weapons program. It had been slowed down by the German invasion of the Soviet Union, but they have their own program developing slowly. And actually, it's based largely on information that they've stolen from the Manhattan Project. Soviet spies were aware of what was going on, had an idea of what the Americans were trying to develop, and they have a spy ring inside of it, which succeeds actually in taking a large amount of information from the USA. And so in 1949, they successfully detonated an atomic weapon, the RDS-1, based on the Fat Boy bomb dropped by the Americans on Japan. And it took the USA completely by surprise. They genuinely didn't believe the Soviets would have the technology or the ability to achieve this until 1953. The British fought not until 1954. So the Soviets are 4 years earlier than the Americans expected. And we can see an image just down here of the RDS-1 being tested. So the Soviets in 1949 have their own atomic bomb. And this changes the balance of power in the Cold War because the USA no longer holds that technological advantage, which remember they needed to negate the impact of the Red Army, negate the fact the Soviets had such a superiority of manpower. And it means that situations like Berlin are less likely to happen again, that the USA can no longer go into a situation assured that the Soviets won't do anything because they don't have that advantage anymore. And so this now develops the arms race, whereby both sides are going to compete to outdo the other in terms of weapons and technology. And so we see in 1952 that the USA tests its first hydrogen bomb. Okay, this is 2,500 times more powerful than the atomic bomb used on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So we've developed another type of nuclear weapon now. But then a year later, in 1953, the USSR tests its own hydrogen bomb, immediately removing that advantage that the USA had developed. And then in 1957, as part of the space race, the USSR develops intercontinental ballistic missiles, or ICBMs. Okay, this allows nuclear weapons to be delivered by missile rather than being forced to be delivered by aircraft. This is really important for a number of reasons. It increases the range of the weapons. It means that they can be fired much further, makes them more efficient, makes them more effective. And if you're delivering them via aircraft, they're actually quite vulnerable. You could shoot that aircraft down long before it reaches its target, whereas a missile flies much faster and is much more difficult to destroy. It can also be more accurate. So the Soviets have that advantage in 1957. Then in 1958, the USA develops and tests its own ICBMs. So again, that equilibrium is restored. Then in 1959, the USA deploys nuclear-armed Polaris submarines within striking range of the Soviet Union. Again, this is important because submarines are difficult to discover. Because they're underwater, the Soviets wouldn't know their exact locations, therefore they can't target them. This gives the Americans the advantage of being able to potentially launch nuclear weapons without the Soviets even knowing. Then in 1961, the Soviets pull ahead again. Okay, they detonate the Tsar bomber. This is actually the largest man-made explosion in history. It's the biggest nuclear warhead ever detonated in the world, which again shows the power of the weapons that both sides are developing. Then in 1968, the USSR develops an anti-ballistic missile system, which is designed to shoot down US ICBMs. The idea being that they can prevent themselves from being hit, which will allow them to attack the USA without being too worried about retaliation. And in the same year, the USA develops technology that allows one missile to deploy multiple warheads and hit multiple targets. So one missile would then split off and fire numerous nuclear warheads at a range of different targets, which again increases the killing power that the USA has and allows them to potentially destroy more Soviet targets. Now, what this does is leads to an enormous increase in tension because both sides are moving towards what becomes known as mutually assured destruction, or MAD, a situation whereby both sides have the ability to destroy each other utterly by using nuclear weapons. That if one side was to fire its nuclear weapons, the other side would retaliate and both sides would be completely destroyed, which on the one hand is a positive in the sense that it's designed to prevent either side from ever launching their weapons. However, it does mean that if one side were to fire a nuclear weapon, or there was to be a breakdown in communication or a mistake, the consequences would ultimately end the world, such as the power of the weapons that they had. This also spills over into something called a space race, where both sides are competing to have the best technology and win the so-called space race. And there's two key reasons for this. One is that the technology used to reach space could be used to create new and better weapons, which we saw with the development of the ICBMs. But it also gave the country who won it a huge propaganda victory and showed that their political system was the best. Remember, the Cold War is a war of ideas. It's a war between capitalism and communism. And the system that could actually reach space first and establish technology in space first would be showing the rest of the world that it was the best political system and that maybe other countries should convert to it. And so in 1957, the Soviet Union pulls ahead. They launched Sputnik, the first telecommunications satellite, the satellites that we have today that allow our mobile phones to work. The Soviets launched the very first one. And Sputnik 2 was then launched later that year and actually carried a small dog into orbit. The Soviets were the first country to send a living being into orbit, into the Earth's atmosphere. And then in 1959, again, the Soviets launched Luna 1, the first man-made object to orbit the sun. And the USA responds by sending Pioneer 4 to do a flypast to the moon. And then the Soviets launched Luna 2 at the moon. So again, we're seeing this constant competition between both sides to show that they've got the best technology. Then in 1960, huge development, the USA launches the Discovery 14, the first satellite equipped with a spy camera. This gives the Americans the ability to use this satellite to spy on the Earth, so to look in really enormous detail at specific targets, which helps with spying. It helps with them to understand what the Soviets can do. They can monitor things like nuclear testing facilities, like potential nuclear launch facilities, and potentially give them early warning, but also allows them to remove some of the advantages the Soviets had. It makes it much more difficult for the Soviet Union to keep things secret. Then in 1961, a huge advantage, where the Soviet Union puts Yuri Gagarin into space. So the Soviets are the first country to put a man into space. The USA responds with its Apollo missions. Alan Shepard becomes the first American in space, but they're reacting at this point. It looks as though the Soviets hold the advantage. What this leads is for President John F. Kennedy to challenge America to put a man on the moon by the end of the decade. That America, by 1970, will have seized the initiative and will have a man on the moon for the first time. And this is ultimately successful. In 1969, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin become the first men to walk on the moon. This gives America a huge propaganda victory. It allows them to show the world how advanced the technology is, how powerful capitalism is, and ultimately to send a message that capitalism is the way forward. Had the Soviets won that, had they won the space race, they would have had that propaganda victory, which is why why it seemed to be so important that the USA won that. And so the end result is that by 1969, whilst the Americans hold the propaganda victory in terms of military developments, we're at a stalemate. We're at a position whereby both sides have achieved mutually assured destruction and have the potential to utterly destroy each other.